Good afternoon. I know we're at 3:14, but in the interest of adding one more minute to what would be truly an exceptional panel, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator to take that 1 minute to do introductions. Welcome to the panel, Creating the Beloved Community. My name is Professor Diane Desierto. I am a professor of law and global affairs, both at the law school and at the Keough School of Global Affairs. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce the three members of our very distinguished panel. To my left, and who will also be speaking first, is Professor Jacqueline Rivers. She's the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Social Science and Policy of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She is currently a Senior Fellow at the King's College in New York City and has served as a lecturer in both sociology and African American studies at Harvard University. Her publications include The Paradox of the Black Church and Religious Freedom, a chapter in the volume Not Just Good, But Beautiful, and another co-authored with Orlando Patterson in The Cultural Matrix, which was published by Harvard University Press. Dr. Rivers is a senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience at King's College. She holds a PhD from Harvard University, where she was a doctoral fellow in the multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. She is also a graduate research fellow of the National Science Foundation. Dr. Rivers, welcome. To the left of Dr. Rivers is Professor Ernest Morel, who serves as the College of Arts and Letters Associate Dean for Humanities and Equity and directs the National Council of Teachers of English James R. Squire Office for Policy Research in the English Language. Dean Morel, who is a very valued colleague on my end working on DEI here at the university, is our Coyle Professor of Literacy Education, a member of the faculty in the English and Africana Studies departments, and he directs the Center for Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. He's an elected fellow of the American Educational Research Association, the past president of the National Council of Teachers of English, and a co-convener of the African Diaspora International Research Network. From 2015 to 2021, Dean Morel has been annually ranked, or I should say only because the rankings are up to 2021, we're still in 2022. Dean Morel has been annually ranked among the top university-based education scholars in the RHSU EduScholar Public Influence Rankings that are published by EdWeek. Ernest is also the recipient of the NCTE Distinguished Service Award, the Kent Williamson Leadership Award from the Conference on English Leadership, and the Divergent Award for Excellence in 21st Century Literacies. Welcome, Dean Morel. And finally, our speaker to the farthest end from me is Dr. Michael Griffin, who is the Senior Vice President and Interim Provost of Holy Cross College. He is a triple domer, having earned his BA, MDiv, and PhD at the University of Notre Dame. He began his career working for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops before coming to Holy Cross College in 2004. His published works include The Politics of Penance, Proposing an Ethic of Social Repair, and a co-edited volume on healthcare, medicine, and social justice, entitled In the Company of the Poor. In 2015, he became the chair of the Holy Cross Theology Department and founding director of the college's Saints and Scholars Institute. He was then appointed senior vice president in 2017. Welcome, Dr. Griffin. So to start our program, our speakers will have roughly 10 to 12 minutes to speak on the panel, and then we will invite them to conversation. This is going to be a very conversational and interactive discussion, we hope, that will be of interest to everybody, and we will open up for questions immediately after our speakers' interventions. Dr. Rivers, please begin.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with you, my favorite conference, the De Nicholas Center Fall Conference. And I am Many thanks to the center and to my fellow panelists for this opportunity to talk about this topic. I must say the idea of the beloved community on a university campus still I find challenging. So I'm very interested to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. What I wanted to start out with is just to talk about how Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. saw the idea of the beloved community. For him, this idea was really rooted in justice, with a focus on racial justice. King had a really profound commitment to ending racial segregation and to ending the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South prior to the 50s. And one example is when he enters the fray with the Montgomery bus boycott. And the objective is there to end racial segregation on local buses. But to King, it was far more than that. The beloved community really was the goal. He didn't see the obliteration of Jim Crow laws in the South or even winning the right for blacks in the South to vote as the ultimate goal. He said the end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community. So it's impossible for me to talk about the beloved community without taking into consideration the idea of justice and more explicitly of racial justice. But it wasn't just about justice, it was also expressly economic equality. King was ardently opposed to unbridled capitalism, which he saw as a source of great evil and implicated in the racial injustice that blacks suffered in the South. According to Kenneth Smith and Ira Zepp in their article on King and the Beloved Community, King could not envision the beloved community apart from the alleviation of economic inequality and the achievement of economic justice. In fact, Dr. King dies launching the Poor People's Campaign as he assists garbage workers in Memphis in striking against unjust working conditions and seeking better pay. And what motivates King in both his concern for justice and economic equality is really a commitment to agape, to the love, to the divine love, to the idea that we put the rights and needs of others above our own. And closely affiliated with that is the idea that we love our enemies even as and rather than hating them. So King saw the beloved community as a place where people would experience this kind of equality, where there wouldn't be discrimination, where conflict would be solved not by violence, but by arbitration. He sought harmony, understanding, respect, and agape among blacks and whites, among all people. I quote him again, "Only a refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change to our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives." So this is my understanding of the beloved community, this idea of justice, economic equality, deeply rooted in agape and in love of the other, even of the enemy. Obviously, this resonates with many teachings in Catholic social teaching. There's a similar commitment to justice. According to Pope Paul VI, if you want peace, work for justice. And in this idea of justice, John Paul II in Solicitudo Rei Sociale says, "The teaching and spreading of her social doctrine are part of the Church's evangelizing mission. It consequently gives rise to a commitment to justice according to each individual's role, vocation, and circumstances." Again, this commitment to justice, which is so central to the idea of the beloved community. Another theme in Catholic social teaching is the option for the poor and the vulnerable. John Paul II, in the same encyclical, says, "This love of preference for the poor and the decisions which it inspires in us cannot but embrace the immense multitudes of the hungry, the needy, the homeless, those without medical care, and above all, those without hope of a better future. This applies so powerfully to the Black community, both in the South during the 50s, but even today in inner city neighborhoods, where Cornel West has described the violence that occurs between young Black men as the fruit of a kind of nihilism, a hopelessness, despair, meaninglessness. So Catholic social teaching has powerful application in the Black community. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium says, "Today we have to say, 'Thou shalt not,' to an economy of exclusion and inequality," resonating with King's commitment to economic justice. And in the social teaching on the call to community, Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate says, "Love respects personal dignity by recognizing in the person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others," which I think is really relevant to discussing how we ought to be interacting in the university in terms of dealing with our hot button issues. But in thinking about this, it seemed to me that Dr. King's dream of the beloved community was destined to be limited. I don't think that that's how King saw it. King saw this as something that he was working to bring into reality. Yet, from my perspective, we live in a fallen world, and a world in which even within the church, even within among Christians, the commitment to agape is somewhat limited, shall we say. Certainly in the wider world, the idea that you would be committed to putting the interests of others above your own is not widely held. And as such, that must limit the realization of the beloved community. King and the civil rights workers, the civil rights movement, and I really want to say that this was about the work of thousands of Black people who took to the streets, who were willing to face down police dogs and policemen with batons and fire hoses. The achievements of the civil rights movement were substantial. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, these were substantial and played a major role in transforming the South from a place of racial terror to a much more just society. But we've seen a lot of those gains rolled back in the subsequent decades. The Voting Rights Act has been defanged by the Supreme Court, by decisions about the inapplicability of certain provisions of the Act, that states which historically have a record of discrimination no longer have to get permission from the courts in order to change rules around voting. And right now, before the Supreme Court is a case coming out of Alabama, which may be the death knell of the Voting Rights Act, pointing to how limited the beloved community is in our fallen world, and also to the fact that it is an ideal for which we must constantly work, that we can never rest. So how does it apply in the university? In a Catholic university or in a secular university? Which is where I have spent much of my time, in secular universities. The core values of the university do not match those of the beloved community, from my perspective. Really, the commitment is to academic freedom and the pursuit of truth, not to love and brotherhood, and I don't know if they even know the meaning of the word agape. So I took a look at Cornell University's core values. And at the top of the list was, and I quote, "the discovery through learning, teaching, and scholarship." There was also a commitment to open inquiry and expression. The very purpose is a pursuit of knowledge, even ideas some may consider wrong or offensive. Now, community didn't make it to the list. I was actually a little surprised to see. There's also a commitment to a community of belonging, that the university values diversity and inclusion, creating a welcoming, caring, and equitable community conversation. And that's as close as they get to agape, caring, at one word. And there are other values, I won't quote them right now. So I also took a look at Notre Dame's mission statement. Top of the list, pursuit of truth and academic freedom. as I would have expected. And I was delighted to see also to develop in students a disciplined sensibility to poverty, injustice, and oppression that burdens the lives of so many. So resonating with that core idea of justice, and they don't literally say it, but economic equality. I was also pleased to see that there was, and this is as close as I saw in their mission statement or anything regarding Agape, to develop a sense of community and responsibility through residential life. I think that despite that, the university has played an important role in advancing justice and equality, in particular around racial equality, through scholarship. I want to point to the work of William Julius Wilson on inner city poverty among blacks. Much of his research carried out in Chicago. Wilson brought to the attention of a scholarly world which was unwilling to touch the question of black poverty after the debacle of Patrick Moynihan's piece on black families. He brought the black poor to the attention of the scholarly world and pointed out that the loss of jobs through deindustrialization had had a devastating impact in inner city communities, robbing men of jobs, leading to counterproductive cultural traits such as the loss of soft job skills, all as a result of this restructured economy, and that in turn had led to a decline in marriage, or was associated with a decline in marriage and a rise in father-absent households. Or the work of Bruce Western on racialized mass incarceration. He highlighted the shocking increase in incarceration among poor black men and pointed out that 2/3 of black men without a high school diploma would be incarcerated at some point in their lives. This was built, Lawrence Bobo and Victor Thompson build on this work to point out that much of the incarceration revolves around drug arrests and the racial inequalities that were implicit there, as most famous among them, of course, being the fact that there were inequitable sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine, which was common among blacks, versus powder cocaine, which was much more common among whites, 10 times longer sentences for crack. And I'd also point to the work of James Q. Wilson on the effect of cultural shifts in the decline of the family, how our changing cultural values, the acceptability of out-of-wedlock birth has led to a huge increase, has been part of. Wilson wouldn't say, and it certainly wouldn't be true, that it was the sole driver, but part of the shift to the fact that now we have 2/3 of black children being raised without both parents, and that the acceptability of divorce has led to a situation where in the 1980s, 1 in 2 marriages were ending in divorce. But what has also been accompanied by that is a perverse effect on the pursuit of justice, that there's an intolerance of any view that differs from the collective wisdom. So at one of the universities where I teach, a professor at a very liberal university assigned material from one conservative scholar, and his students were outraged, not wanting to read the work of one conservative scholar on a syllabus that was dominated by liberal scholars. There's also, I think, a lack of honest debate. I've had a student come to me after class and say, I don't know how you raise these controversial topics. In most of my classes, we just all agree with each other and talk with our hands. I was like, what? And there's a kind of punitive atmosphere, intimidation. So I spoke at something called Courageous Conversations, and one of the other speakers came to me afterwards and said, I really admire your speaking out so frankly about your support for life and biblical marriage when you are in the academy, because to do so is to take a certain level of risk. So I think I want to wrap up. I want to suggest some things that we might do to improve the atmosphere. And I point to a program that's been implemented at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where the university sponsors college-wide conversations on topics, these hot-button topics, by scholars with opposing views. I don't know how many of you have seen Cornel West and Robbie George do this. And they model these, so it's a series of conversations to signal to students, one, that we can differ respectfully, that we can love each other even as we hold opposing views. And they went further to actually put in place a course required for all freshmen on argumentation. How can you evaluate even your own beliefs? How can you evaluate the arguments that are being proposed by others? How can you listen with an open mind and perhaps even think about revising your own positions? I know, radical thought. It seems to me to that we could add facilitated conversations among students on these hot-button topics. Or in the Catholic University, maybe to focus on teaching this Catholic social traditions, perhaps based in dorms, in places where people already have relationships and can begin to use that. So I just want to close by citing again Benedict XVI, that love respects personal dignity by recognizing in the person a subject who's always capable of giving something to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rivers. We now proceed with Dean Morrell.
Thank you. So my nightmare last night, when I realized I was following Dr. Rivers, was that she was going to say everything that I wanted to say, but much better than I could. I wouldn't be able to follow her. So that has come true. But I also believe that repetition is the pathway to mastery.
Amen.
I will go ahead and give my talk. I want to start with a couple of thank yous. Just thank you to Carter Sneed and Margaret and Ken and Petra and the whole DeNicola Center team. As Dr. Rivers was saying, this is an amazing conference and a rare conference to be able to have in the Academy, so I thank them for that. Thank Diane for chairing the session. Thank my colleagues for kind of backstopping my limitations on this area. I wanted to connect this idea of a beloved community to creation. I hadn't thought about it per se in the work that I've done, but thinking about the conference, it's always nice to tie the individual parts of a conference to a larger theme. So I began thinking about the goodness of creation and how that connects to the notion of beloved community. Then as I kept thinking about these comments, I revised it slightly to the goodness in creation. It is really important for distinguishing what I would call a Christian perspective or a faith-based perspective from a secular one. There are a couple of points I think that are important before we get into the notion of community. It's just the notion of self and other. One, we are created in the image of God. And that's the collective we, not just the small we's that we find ourselves in, but the larger we. We are created as one species, one global community, and you see that language over and over again in the Bible, but in other sacred texts, where we want to talk about a multiplicity of the human family. There's one family, there's one body. And in that notion, I think we must challenge ourselves to see God's creation in others. That's an important imperative to being able to participate in a beloved community. As I say, to see them, to see others, and I have that a large O, to see others as God sees them is our responsibility as we walk in faith. The third aspect of the goodness in creation is that we are not created to live alone in isolation, nor are we created to live in conflict. And I'll continue to come back to that. Conflict is the major headwind to the beloved community. And the final point is there is no us and them in God's creation. There's only us and, well, us. Right? And that's a huge distinction. And I'll frame my comments in this notion that, like, the air we breathe in the Academy is conflict and othering, right? And seeing ourselves as distinct from others, which is a real impediment to seeing ourselves as being in community, which is more naturally connected to how we were created. So there are three kind of major moves in my 10 minutes. One is this notion we are commanded to live in community. The second is the proliferation but the limitations of conflict theories and theorizing. And the third is a move, some of what Dr. Rivers has already started to do in her remarks, is to move from conflict theorizing to co-participation as a way forward. Before I jump into the remarks, I just want to start with a quote from Sister Thea Bowman. She says, "We unite ourselves." Am I still in your stuff here?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. It's like I could skip over this quote. We unite ourselves with Christ's redemptive work when we reflect to our brothers and sisters God's healing, God's forgiveness, and God's unconditional love. That's the agape love that Dr. Rivers was talking about. So this first move, we are commanded to live in beloved community. And so people often ask me, are there particular texts that you would recommend to think about, diversity, equity, inclusion? I say, have you read the Gospel according to John? And it's like, there's this guy. It was a long time ago, but he said some pretty good things about how we can live together in community. So I start with John, from John 15 says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." It's a singular commandment. I mean, it's the last dinner with these folks he's been hanging out with for several years. And it's not a long-winded discourse. It's a singular commandment, right? If I summed up my gospel, if I summed up my 3 years with you, it is about loving one another. There are 3 moves in this statement that I think are important. The first is, he says earlier in the chapter, as God loves me, I love you. Right? And the second move is, as I love you, you should love one another. But it comes around to this notion of our love for each other is a manifestation of God's love for us. Right? And you think about how that love is manifested into creation. Right? That's our commandment. Like, basically, as much as is possible in your human frailty and sinful nature, you need to love one another as God loves you. It is a definitive statement, right? It is not ambiguous. It is a commandment. It is not an encouragement. It's not a good idea. We are commanded to do this by the Son of God. So being created in the image of God, as we are, enables us to love and to see as God sees through our human eyes. Dr. has already cited this quote from Martin Luther King, so I will just kind of paraphrase some of it. When he talks about his beloved community, the end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. The type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love. It's not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all humans. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men and women. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. So the second move is really understanding what the headwinds are. This seems like a good idea, right? Loving one another, living in community. Why is it so difficult? Again, I'm going to go back. This is not John, but it's Matthew. It's the discourse of Christ, though. You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This is from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun rise on the bad and good and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? And if you greet your brothers and sisters only, what is unusual about that? So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. Challenge, though, is much of the discourse at colleges and universities is fueled by what critical theorists would call conflict theory. It's never named as such. It's never talked about as such, but it is the air we breathe in the academy. The basic idea of conflict theory is that progress can only be achieved through warfare. Those who are opposed are considered as enemies, as ideologues, as oppressors, who need in turn to be oppressed. The methods of this work are aggressive. Dialogue is seen as weakness. Love is weakness. Forgiveness is weakness. Reconciliation is weakness. And it's important to understand that the German philosopher Karl Marx is the initial and ultimate manifestation of conflict theory. Religion and God in conflict theories are opiates for the masses. What we see instead are protests, shout-downs, and takeovers. Media messages that portray those we disagree with as totally evil or ignorant. This work is dangerous. Ultimately, it reinforces cycles of oppression and cultures of distrust. Again, comments that Dr. Rivers made in her talk, so I won't reiterate that so much. At colleges and universities, We have witnessed civil dialogue breaking down in our classes. Students and faculty can shame and disparage anyone they view as an oppressor without getting to know them or care about them as human beings. Certainly not the agape love that Christ commands us to manifest. However, the other person is perceived as different. They can be silenced, shouted down, shamed, even humiliated, sometimes with tacit consent by other students and instructors. Conflict approaches can dehumanize those who are already vulnerable. Conflict theories can turn individuals into bitter and hate-filled subjects who long for vengeance rather than justice. A danger in education is that adults can unintentionally weaponize young people to serve their own interest and thirst for conflict under the auspices of a syllabus or dialogue or the production of knowledge. What you really have is ideology and not epistemology. Our approach needs to be and remain rooted in love, in the truth of the gospel, in brother and sisterhood, in a notion of mutual liberation, in dialogue and understanding, in collective healing. No good comes from learning to hate. However, being more concerned about conflict and co-participation will prevent the church and our communities from optimizing our potential to be a force for good in the modern world. And so we can't talk about this notion of beloved community without talking about what has become an ingrained thirst for conflict and a necessary othering, the creating of enemies like boogeymen and women. The third move, and I'll quote Bishop Desmond Tutu before moving into that. We are living in a historic moment. We are each called to take part in a great transformation. Our survival as a species is threatened by global warming, economic meltdown, and ever-increasing gap between rich and poor. Yet these threats offer an opportunity to awaken as an interconnected and beloved community. Similar to Dr. Rivers, I think that there are answers to how to envision and even create this beloved community in our Catholic social tradition. Catholic social teaching is a central and essential element of our faith. Its roots are in the Hebrew prophets who announced God's special love for the poor and called God's people to a covenant of love and justice. It is a teaching founded on the life and words of Jesus Christ, who came to bring glad tidings, liberty, and a recovery of sight to the blind. I believe you talked about solidarity, a call to serve the poor, and family, community, and participation. I'm going to talk about the latter. Right? This notion of a call to family, community, and participation is, I think, a connective tissue between the Gospels and the world today as we think about what it means to enact this beloved community. In considering this theme, call to family, community, and participation, we're reminded by the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops that the person is not only sacred but also social. How we organize our society directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. Family is a central social institution that must be supported and strengthened, but so are communities. The USCCB further advocates that people have a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together for the common good and well-being of all. There are two principles that are germane to the discussion here. One is thinking about how oppression manifested in ways such as structural racism assault the notion of family and community. Again, it's back to that othering. There are us and there are them. Totally incongruent with God's notion of creation, a singularity to that creation and a singularity to the body that we are, that Christ calls us to participate in, and his apostles such as Paul. How do we, in this particular notion as a Catholic community, participate in communities that transcend divides? Is that possible? Not only is it possible, it is mandated and is necessary to participate in communities that transcend divides. It doesn't mean we transcend difference, but that we transcend divides. In Romans 12, Paul writes that in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. But in this notion of the body, harming another person is like chopping off your own finger. Right? I mean, do we see the discourses of division and hatred as harming ourselves, our own body? This notion of other is a created notion. This notion of self is a created notion. What we are members of community, right? Members of a singular body, right? A singular church, a singular faith, a singular planet, right? The divisions are our creation, not God's. Thea Bowman also says, people think they have to do big things. This is kind of where we move from here in order to make change. But if each one would light a candle, we'd have a tremendous light. So I want to conclude by thinking about what it means to form beloved communities in classrooms and schools. And a lot of it kind of dovetails with what Professor Rivers has said. I tried to have 5 points, so like it last 10 minutes, I think I'm at kind of 9.5. I couldn't tell jokes, it couldn't be funny and get it done in 10 minutes. Number one is reminding our students of our commandment to love. Like, what is this notion of like a commandment to know, right? What we are commanded to do is to love and live in community. What's the point of knowing if it doesn't bring us closer to one another and to our God manifested selves? Right? So we have to bring the L word on the campuses and classrooms, right? And not think of it as soft or somehow antithetical to a scholarly disposition, because that's not true. Two, and this is kind of the big one, we have to teach students and faculty about conflict theorizing and its limitations, right? Everything we do is theoretically informed, but it's the theories we don't talk about that are the most dangerous. Right, the theories that are the air we breathe, right, the theories that we are acculturated to. So it's important for us to teach about conflict theory. Like, this is not the way that people have interacted since the beginning of time, right? It comes from a specific place for a specific reason, and that reason is really antithetical to our notion of participating in community. I think you also said, Professor, emulating and demanding civility and dialogue, right, and what that, and how to teach that, right? I worry about this kind of, dichotomy between teaching content and teaching skills, right? And so what really lasts in terms of our education is not necessarily the content, but the skill sets and dispositions we develop, right? We have to learn how to talk about complicated issues. It is not a natural skill set. So how much of the curriculum of universities is not about what to talk about, but how to talk in the first place? And as my grandma would say, you have one mouth and two ears for a reason, right? So critical vocality or polyvocality also necessitates a critical listening, a capacity to hear, right, and to understand. That's an important component to reconciliation. Our comments in classrooms and in meetings and in discussions and in colloquia should be rooted in love. They can be critical comments, but it is a critical love. Fourth, we critique ideas, not people. I remember a colleague I had at Columbia, there was an interaction with another one of our colleagues, and this colleague started talking about a particular person, and this colleague of mine, Gayatri Spivak, many of you know, she said, we must not do that. We must not talk about people. We talk about ideas. People we care about. Ideas we critique. And that is important, right? And it's just like, I could go on about, kind of what being like woke could mean in a classroom and breaking somebody down. And like, we cannot do that, right? First of all, we should be untethered to our ideas in a beloved community. We put them out there to be refined and be shaped. That's what it means to take work seriously. But people we love, ideas we critique. Right? That is the university that enables a beloved community. 5, and finally, we can't just study together. We have to break bread together. We have to laugh together. And when possible, we have to pray together. Without this, nothing is possible. And I agree that we're at the nascent stages, but I also believe that through God, all things are possible. If we return to our creation, the beloved community is a natural outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Morrell. Dr. Griffin.
Thanks. It is a real honor to be part of this dialogue, and after hearing Jackie and Ernest, I feel that honor more deeply. And so I want to start by noting two things, as you said, thinking together, laughing together. Something that was said by each of you, one that made me laugh a little bit and one that made me think even more. I'm not sure how the reference to, how I let the reference to being a triple domer get into my intro. However, then Jackie mentions that the closest the Notre Dame mission statement gets to the beloved community is talking about the residence halls. And I had to laugh because I had not really thought about my, my undergraduate years in Morrissey Manor as a time in the beloved community. However, it then made me think too, because you know, that was actually maybe where I learned that term. And I wanted just to throw this out there if people are noting those who are really helping the world know about this vision. My rector as an undergrad here when I came in 1989 was Joseph Ross, who is a poet in D.C. who just published a book of poetry called Raising King, on King's notion of the beloved community. So, I do think actually in the residence halls, when we think about the academic, sort of the way the university or the college can be part of creating the beloved community, it probably was in Morrissey Manor that I first learned about it. And then to Ernest, one of the things, I have a number of things to say too, but you know, the providential reference to you know, cutting off our finger, and we're not parts of different bodies. We're not separate, one body. This morning at Mass at my kid's school, at Holy Cross Grade School, either Father Jim was being novel with the lectionary, or that was actually the reading for Mass today. We are many parts, but one body. So that really helped to make me think. What I'd like to do, and I really do think as we then move into the discussion part, that there are going to be deep resonances for discussion here. I wanted to talk about the way we as scholars approach any concept, especially one like the beloved community. And one of the things, you know, that we can, as scholars, bring to the world is that we are complexifiers, we are nuancers, we are problematizers, people who can help the world see less in dichotomies and more in nuance. And so one of the things that I wanted to start with is saying, what is it that needs to be complexified in the current moment, in the current situation, and what needs to be problematized? And one of the things I wanted to be sort of clear about, in my view, is that the first thing that I think that as scholars in the academy trying to create the beloved community is we have to problematize the dominating left-right paradigm that grips our society. Now, in the Catholic tradition, we have deep resources for this. And so I wanted to tell two stories to start. One about my mom and one about my beloved Holy Cross College. So this is a story about my mom and Cardinal Ritter in the 1960s. And about, you know, even at the time as that King is sharing the concept and notion of the beloved community. Cardinal Ritter integrated the Catholic schools of St. Louis by dictate. This happened in other major cities, in Washington, D.C., in New Orleans. And one of the things that my mom always shares, and it's kind of a complex question, because in the way she would bring it up is, at the time, the resistance to Cardinal Ritter is that there wasn't enough voice of the people, that it was undemocratic. It was done as a dictate from the Archbishop, from the Cardinal. And my mom talks about the resistance in St. Louis to his decision to say, and this is 10 years before Brown v. Board of Education. This is 10 years before Brown v. Board of Education. So, and it's actually before the Montgomery bus boycotts. And you know, we're talking in the 1940s. And so she said at the time, people felt like that this was done very, very much sort of against a popular movement. And it was very unpopular. Now, again, my point here is not to say anything about like the extent to which, you know, church officials should or shouldn't be democratic. The point here, though, is it sort of disrupted a paradigm that this integration of the Catholic schools came in a way that didn't make sense to a lot of people, but it came. The second point from a couple points from just observing these last 20 years at Holy Cross College is I thought back to to 1 year in which, within the span of 1 week, the following 3 events happened. One is Holy Cross College became one of the first colleges in the nation to give scholarships to undocumented students at a time when there was even legislation that would make helping undocumented students and undocumented people potentially illegal. The Holy Cross College Saints for Life group began a along with Notre Dame and St. Mary's students, began a very important act of every week being a presence at the local abortion clinic to eventually and successfully end the killing of unborn children at that clinic. And in the balcony of the main atrium at Holy Cross College, we spent 24 hours speaking slowly the names of all those who had died from the United States and Iraq of the Iraq War. This was a kind of dizzying week at the college that disrupted narratives that made any one of those issues part of a left or a right. And so just as we can look today to see how that paradigm is gripping us, I think the first job of any of us in college who are teaching, who are forming intellectual communities, is to really resist those narratives. And so that leads to my 3 points that can lead us into discussion. One is that we remember that the college and university comes ex corde ecclesia, from the heart of the church, not ex dexter ecclesia, nor ex sinister ecclesia, not from the left of the church nor the right of the church, but from the heart of the church. And what that means is we resist the absorption into the secular categories that, if we are honest, are even gripping more and more people in the church. And we name this as a problem. And we look at our own blind spots. You know, one of the sub-themes of this panel is the role of Catholic social teaching, or I think so helpful, Jackie, you even referenced, as John Paul often did, as Catholic social doctrine. You know, Catholic social teaching is not a list of options that we might do. As you know, we oppose abortion and euthanasia, and then here's some things about economics and race that are just sort of like on the table as maybe good housekeeping tips. No, this is the social magisterium of the church, Catholic social doctrine. And when Benedict XVI, both in Deus Caritas Est and Caritas in Veritate, talked about what's the role of Catholic social doctrine, one of the things that he always emphasized was it is a corrective to blind spots. That when we look at Catholic social doctrine, it is a corrective to blind spots. Perhaps blind spot to not seeing Christ in the migrant, not seeing Christ in the unborn, not seeing Christ on death row. And each of us, I think, if we want to come at this from the heart of the church, from ex corde ecclesia, has to look at this question of blind spots and resisting the categories that we can be absorbed into in a way that doesn't reflect the full and integrated magisterium of the church. So that's the first point. We have to come ex corde ecclesia. The second point, I'll give a nod here to 2 great mentors of mine and a book. And the second point is about the open circle. So our president, Holy Cross College, Dr. Marco Clark, who's here, when he came on board Holy Cross, he said, here's the book I want to frame our intellectual life together. It's a book by Father Jim Heft, longtime provost at University of Dayton. And as one who was educated by the Marianist brothers, that resonated with me. And Dr. Clark said, I want us to be guided by this book at Holy Cross because it shows that the twin temptations right now, in Father Heft's language, are to become a fortress, a circle that has clear lines, but there's no room for anyone to come in, or ideas that challenge, or being open to discussions that are, that feel dangerous, So on one, there's the fortress option, but then there's the marketplace option, where whether it's prestige or money or whatever is the move of the moment to make headway in the market, you lose a sense of there being any circle at all. And so I would suggest in the second point is that we think about how a college or university can be part of the beloved community, that you think about it, that we think about it as forming an open circle. Not being a place where people say, well, there's no there there. We're not really sure what that place is about. But not being a place where people wonder if they belong. So an open circle. Very similar, I love the reference to agape. The open circle, the open table, which was, of course, one of the hallmarks of Jesus' ministry, is, what the biblical scholars call open commensality, that open table fellowship, that be a hallmark of what we can do as people who want to bring about the beloved community. Then the third and last point, which I said to someone before, you'll know if I've got guts or not if I make my third point. So I was a little nervous about this one. But actually, this is one where it resonates. All right, where it resonates with, this has been brought up. And I'm going to sharpen it a little bit, because what we're saying is we got to be open to, conversation makes us all a little uncomfortable. All right, so for King, in some sense, the inner core of the beloved community was and is nonviolence. And this has been mentioned a little bit. I know Ernest talked about conflict theory and the ways in which our campuses have been, we have been kind of trained in a form of like dialogical or intellectual warfare. But we also have to note that our campuses, even Catholic colleges and universities, are campuses that have been intertwined with actual warfare. King noted, and we've talked about two of them, but King noted at the end of his life, in the Poor People's Campaign, in speeches during the Vietnam era, that what we're really facing is what he called the triple evils of racism, capitalism, and militarism. Again, this is, especially, there's a long history of, today's Veterans Day. These are complicated topics that we have to really approach with sensitivity. It's also the feast of St. Martin of Tours, who is very interesting. This is the complexifiers, right? So it was St. Martin is a patron of soldiers who was a conscientious objector. Both, in fact, you think just to geek out for a minute, St. Martin of Tours is a saint because he left the military by seeing a beggar. He cut his kappa in half to give warmth to the beggar, left the military, and his kappa, this is where we get the word chapel, his kappa was enshrined as a relic in the capella. And it was both used by militaries as a kind of relic that could give them a sense of divine accompaniment, but also it's a relic of one who left that world. So I want to make sure in our discussion, and this third point is that we don't domesticate King and his vision. It was deeply Christocentric nonviolence. And again, not easy. Now, one of the things that can help us do, just to maybe close by noting that first point of disrupting narratives, I think that if we can live with that discomfort a little bit, we see that the sense of nonviolence and even King's critique of that and the mechanisms of violence can also be that thread that puts us into new paradigms other than left and right. Certainly, whatever else one would say about the very difficult and complex issues of abortion and war, what both have in common is the recourse to violence to solve a problem. And I think what nonviolence can do is help open up a kind of space that can see into the heart of the kind of community Jesus was facing. As Ernest mentioned, that mandatum novum, the new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. Again, that open table fellowship, indeed. That sense of justice, indeed. Jesus' way is a way of nonviolence. And that's something that all of us, I think, have to contend with. And so that's the kind of the quote I'll end with and give us time to discuss is a quote on this of, you think about another great icon of the beloved community, Dorothy Day. You said that our job, and this should be our job in forming our students, is to comfort the help them to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so that has to be turned in on ourselves to also say, what paradigms have we each gained comfort with? And how can we complexify that, problematize that, so we move closer, not to any paradigm of the day, but to the beloved community? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Griffin. I know that we have 20 minutes for a very fraught topic, and I want to give everybody as much space as possible, so I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative to collect 3 questions at a time, trusting that our panelists will engage in discussion. So anybody please raise your hands, the gentleman in front, please, and here and here. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3, and then I'll call for another round of questions. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Real quick. The King narrative is more complicated than it appears. The one-note song, Nonviolence. Let's put King, 1859, slave revolts. All right, now, I love King. King's not the final word for me. I put myself in 1859. The mother of my children has been violated, and they steal my child. Old Massa up the hill got my kid. Now, what do I do? In other words, there's the King narrative. Then there is the issue of war on the part of slaves. So, and my question is, King would have had a tough time with the slaves if he had come saying what he had said to people who had been terribly violated and who were in a state of war. What's the complicated, unsimplistic answer?
And the second question.
Hey there. You were talking about like co-participation, you know, as a part of a beloved community. So I was like, what a co-participation in what, like, as in like, as like we're continually like more division as our small towns are dying, and so like how can we create participation, you know, and sort of laugh together, et cetera, et cetera. And also, how do we allow a community to create a loving community? Like you were talking about, like capitalism, militarism, and racism. Like, and so like most people can't really do anything about capitalism without that's unchecked, you know, without values. So like, how do we allow change for that?
Hi, my name's Thomas. I'm a townie.
Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Let's see, this is going to be tough to nail down maybe, but I was wondering y'all's thoughts on, right, in a room full of academics and students or alums of places, right, how do we go about thinking about the beloved community and living well together in environments where nobody does the dishes, so to speak, right? Like, we're at a university in particular here where it's super nice, right? Like, we have great food and people do a lot of the behind the scenes work so that other people are freed up to think. And yet when we all leave at some point, right? I mean, right, I just moved into a house recently for the first time, and I'm realizing, like, wow, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this house, and that takes up a lot of my thinking time. But just trying to think of, like, how do we think about living well in community together, where in a world where we don't have to bear each other's burdens, so to speak. I realize it's super general. I realize there are exceptions to that. But yeah, just if y'all have any thoughts on, like, doing community well in this environment versus doing community well on the other side of Portage, where there's a lot more burdens to be borne by everybody involved.
Now, that first question was meant for the other panelists, right?
Clearly.
No, and again, obviously longer discussions, and certainly I think your point is well taken. Just two thoughts that come in terms of King. You know, I mean, one of the things is his refrain of violence is the language of the oppressed. So I agree. At the end of the day, there can be a critique of King, you know, on the depth of his commitment to nonviolence. And so maybe I would just leave it as one is I feel like there were moments in his life, well, not just moments, it was part of his own approach that there are moments where those who are oppressed have no recourse but to violence. I think his point would not have been to judge or to critique that, but to also leave some space between that and the beloved community. But again, I mean, I think, you know, certainly King doesn't have to be the last word. But the other thing I was going to mention in terms of that is that for King too is that sense of making sure that when we look at questions of war, when we look at questions of militarism, you know, because he would address things like, you know, he would talk about those, you know, who are rioting and Molotov cocktails, and is to distinguish sort of a theoretical question about is violence ever defensible from sort of the larger military industrial complex. Yeah. Yeah.
No,
So,
no, I'm not being rude or just.
There are two other people in mind.
See, that's not my question.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about militarism. When I talk about slave revolts.
Right,
I talk about militarism.
right.
So I don't want you to distort it.
Right.
By glossing it, military-industrial complex, when I'm talking about some slaves who have been violated.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, so your thinking is there's no just war.
Yeah.
The Catholics, you guys believe.
No, we have a just war thinking. I think the only point I wanted to make was that when we think about King, it's sort of the point you made is he makes us pause on that. So yeah, no, my point is not to speak to, you know, is to speak to the question of is violence ever justified in that regard, but that we should just always problematize it by King just makes us pause on that a little bit. Yeah.
I'll be quick and try to answer bits of the second and third. As you were asking your question, I was thinking about, like, at the large sense, co-participation just seems impossible, right? And how, like, all the barriers to it, time, logistics. I was going back to the Thea Bowman quote about if each one would light a candle, like, what does that look like in co-participation? I think it means a couple of things. How do I cross the boundaries I have set for myself to know others and to be with others? It could be if I'm in a dorm, people who I don't know, calling them by name. You know, it could be finding social opportunities to come together. So it doesn't have to be large for all of us. I remember one neighborhood I moved in, the person who left a map of all the houses and the names of the people who lived in them. So you would know and call them by name, you know, and if there was a storm and, you know, somebody really couldn't get that tree lifted. And it's the small ways that we participate as family and community. I don't think it's let's come together to talk about racism or let's come together to talk about Roe. It's let's come together. And so I think about that each day because there are so many barriers to human co-participation now. Social media, technology, and those sorts of things. So it's how do I start small? right? How do I know someone? How do I think in terms of asking questions instead of making statements? It's all sort of small ways. And it relates, because I was thinking, I do live on the other side of Portage. And you know, I chose it because it was the neighborhood that most reminded me of home. But I do think there is an element of integration and community that are important, right? It's not just integration at the policy level, but how do we become integrated in the lives of others? And so one of the things I think that's distinctly American in my travels is like segregation, right? The segregation here is real. Like communities have names and gates in front of them, right? And so how do we come out on the other side of that? What are real ways? So yeah, if you live in a city like South Bend and you really can cross west of that river, and it's a totally different world than it is over here in Notre Dame or Harder Heights. So there's a physically integrative part of the community, right? I love that. And it's not about feeling guilty about it, but it is understanding, like, how did this happen on our watch? Like, is it a sin to segregate? Right? I mean, it's a real question. And it's not saying you have to change your address, but how do I become connected to folks? You know, and not in a way that is philanthropic, right? But in a way that is agape. And I think that a heuristic for it, a model for it, is something we need to develop, right? Because it could seem very kind of patriarchal or hierarchical, and that's not what we mean at all. But I totally agree that we have to figure out ways to integrate and do work together. And some of it is labor, right? Putting in windows, paving roads, and those sorts of things that are less exotic than some new philosophy or whatever. But it's the real work of communities, right?
So I would just say, sort of speaking to the question of nonviolence in King, that Chappell in his book, Stone of Hope, talks about King's nonviolence as coercive. Coercive. That it wasn't a nonviolence of passivity, it was a nonviolence that was determined to change social structures, and that brought to bear pressure on communities and governments and people. That it wasn't a nonviolence that, and I think that that's really important as we think about the beloved community, to bear in mind that it means fighting for justice. It does not mean a kind of passive acquiescence to whatever exists. So I think that that's important to bear in mind when you think about nonviolence.
I'll take a next round of questions, but also exercise the chair's prerogative to ask a question. There's been a lot of focus and discussion, at least in this very rich session, and talking about the beloved community from the standpoint of justice, from looking at the open circle, ensuring that we continue to avoid, or at least recognize our own blinders on conflict theorizing. And you did mention that the end has to be reconciliation. It has to be redemption. We teach in a campus where just a few days ago there was a really intense election, and my own students were also heavily traumatized by a campus event that I had to sit down and engage with them, because everything that they were hearing, in their words, made them feel unsafe. Everything that they were hearing from one speaker in regard to the political views of that speaker somehow made them unsafe. And so there was an unwillingness at a certain point, and from what I heard from my own students, they left the forum in which the student speaker was talking. How does one take the first step towards reconciliation when the very same persons who feel that lack of safety are not in any way moved in agape to try and listen, even if you have two ears? I'll take other questions. I'll call for somebody over there. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, you're far over there, but I want to make sure that I see you. And second question over here, and third question over there.
Thank you. Joachim, this is fascinating. Thanks for the talk, because it led me to lots of questions, but I will try to limit them to two. And quickly, the first is, what is the vision of justice that motivates the beloved community? Like we talked of justice again and again, reference Pope Paul VI, 1972 letter, if you want peace, work for justice. So like what is the vision, the meaning of justice that motivates the beloved community? And the second question is, I think about beloved community as like an ideal, right? That's like Jesus Christ, right, incarnates in the world, that then becomes real in this world where we experience the weakness and the sins of human beings, of creation. And I wonder what it would mean for beloved community to be a real concept, an ideal, but also a real concept that takes cognizance of the sin and the weakness of humanity and all of creation. What would that look like? So for example, how can beloved community, for example, incorporate ideas of, say, protest, non-violence, violence, in a way that both does not throw away the ideal of agape, but does not become so idealistic that it is no longer real. Yeah.
I think our colleague over here, and then the lady over there. Think up here. Thanks. Second question up here. Thanks. So you're going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll turn over to the lady at the back. Yes.
Thank you. Mine is quite different, actually. So, in a world where, well, we were invited by some of the speakers to think outside of like the, oh, this is a left issue, oh, this is a right issue. For those of us who are like, who feel called to participate in politics, maybe in Catholic in circles of the intellectual world, there's a push for a third party. Do you think that opens people to think outside of an ideology, or do you think that builds a third box that makes people not think like in a, this is agape, this is justice, but rather just builds a third world and a third box and the possibility of a new ideology? Thank you.
Please.
So I'd like to speak to the question of justice. And I think that for King that was very concrete, and I think today it is still, can be thought of in very concrete terms. I haven't thought this through, so I don't have a nice succinct answer. But for him, the fact that you can today predict the outcome of the life of a baby by knowing its socioeconomic status and class and race and gender, you can predict fairly accurately that this is a baby boy born in the inner city, a black child, then there's an overwhelming likelihood that that young man is going to end up in prison because according to Bruce Weston, it's now the modal experience of young, uneducated black men. I think that's clearly an issue of justice. There's something wrong. There's an unjust world when a newborn baby, you can predict the course of this baby's life. So I think there are very tangible issues of justice that we need to address. And the point that was raised about residential segregation, that black people in the United States live in poorer neighborhoods regardless than their white counterparts who earn the same amount of money, issues of justice right there. I think that those are the kinds of issues that we need to engage in terms of the beloved community, but I cannot imagine the realization of the beloved community before the coming of Jesus. I think we have to work for it with all of our hearts, but to imagine that we can accomplish it here in the fallen world, that boggles my mind.
So, Dan, can you repeat your question? I remember thinking, I have an answer to it, but then I've already forgotten.
How do you take the first step towards reconciliation in the beloved community?
Yeah, so that, I was recalling, it was a Dalai Lama question. So in 1990, I was able to meet Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama. It was that kind of a year at my university. But we just kept asking the Dalai Lama the same question over and over again. But Mao is so mean, but they have guns, right? Like, what do we, and he just patiently, I think he was patient, just kept answering the question in the same way. your faith is sufficient. You know, let's not complicate our faith, right? Let's do what we are commanded to and assume that is sufficient. Because once we get into the logic of the world, we go inside of a whirlpool and we sink. So I have to tell myself every day, my faith is sufficient. I am commanded to love. It's not if, when. And you think like, oh, back then, like Nazareth, the Roman Empire, I mean, that was the same headwinds that those, he's like, what do you love the Romans? Are you crazy? Right? I mean, it was the same thing. And he says, listen, you have to love the people it's hard to love. So I think we have to be grounded in that, not try to logicize it, you know, follow orders. You know, our Father has commanded us to love. And that is the bedrock of our faith.
You know, one of the other things that hopefully in colleges, universities we can do is and maybe it's a good kind of final point, is to point to others in this conversation. And so the question about justice made me think of one of Notre Dame's gems, a great scholar, Dan Philpott. And he is doing, and I would point anybody in his direction, he's doing really incredible work in building up this notion of justice as right relationship. You know, we have a kind of intellectual inheritance of justice as what one is due. And it can be, you know, and Dan writes about this a lot more, that it can be a little bit more transactional, but he's building out a whole political theory around the concept of justice as comprehensive right relationship, really reconciliation. And so that would be one resource looking at what is the vision of justice that can guide us.
Can I just say one quick thing? Just building off of what Ernest said. So perhaps the thing to say to your students who are so offended, to ask them what the next step is in love.
It's exactly how I wanted to close this session. It's been a wonderful conversation. Yes, in love and agape. Thank you to everybody for participating, and thank you to our panelists.